The security camera footage would later become the most watched military recording in modern history. 43 seconds of silence before the storm. 43 seconds where Admiral Sarah Chun stood frozen in the Pentagon corridor, her service medals catching the fluorescent light, while Commander Marcus Reed's voice echoed through the hallway. "You're nothing but a diversity hire, Chun. You don't belong here." What happened next would bring the most powerful military machine in the world to its knees. In those 43 seconds, Sarah Chun made a decision that would cost her everything she had worked for, but would finally expose the rot that had been festering in the upper ranks for decades. She didn't know that 4 other admirals were watching from their offices, their hands already reaching for their phones. She didn't know that her next move would trigger the largest military investigation in peacetime history. She only knew that after 22 years of service, after leading successful operations in 3 theaters of war, after earning the respect of thousands of soldiers under her command, she was done being pushed around by men who saw her uniform as a costume rather than a symbol of her sacrifice. The push came without warning. One moment, she was walking toward the briefing room. The next, she was stumbling backward, her shoulder hitting the concrete wall with a sound that would haunt the witnesses for years to come. But it wasn't the physical impact that changed everything. It was what Commander Reed said next. Thinking the hallway was empty, thinking no one else could hear him laugh as he watched her regain her balance. "Maybe now you'll remember your place." He was wrong about the empty hallway. He was wrong about no one listening. And he was catastrophically wrong about Sarah Chun remembering her place. Because in that moment, Admiral Chun didn't just represent herself. She represented every woman who had been told she didn't belong, every soldier who had been silenced by rank, and every person who had watched injustice happen and done nothing about it. The 4 admirals who witnessed what happened next would later describe it as the moment the military began to heal itself. But first, it would have to break completely. Sarah Chun had always known she would have to work twice as hard to get half the recognition. It was a lesson taught not through words, but through experience, carved into her understanding through years of being the only woman in rooms full of men who questioned her right to be there. She enlisted in the Navy at 18, fresh out of high school in Sacramento, California, with nothing but determination and a letter of recommendation from her ROTC instructor. Her parents had wanted her to study medicine or law, safe careers that would keep her close to home. Instead, Sarah chose the ocean, choosing uncertainty over security, choosing to serve something larger than herself. The early years were brutal. Basic training pushed her to physical limits she didn't know she possessed. Male recruits tested her resolve with crude jokes and deliberate exclusion. Instructors scrutinized her every move, waiting for signs of weakness that would validate their skepticism about women in combat roles. Sarah responded by outperforming everyone around her. When others completed the required 50 push-ups, she did 75. When the class ran 5 miles, she ran 7. Excellence became her armor against doubt. Her first assignment was aboard the USS Valiant, a destroyer where she served as a communications officer. The ship's captain, a weathered veteran named James Morrison, initially treated her with the polite distance reserved for experiments that might fail. Sarah understood that respect would come only through proving herself indispensable. She volunteered for extra shifts, mastered systems beyond her required knowledge, and never complained about the isolation that came with being one of only 3 women on a crew of 300. The breakthrough came during a storm in the North Pacific. Sarah was monitoring communications when she detected an emergency signal from a cargo ship taking on water 50 miles from their position. The signal was weak, fragmented by the weather, but Sarah's training in signal analysis allowed her to piece together enough information to determine the ship's location. Her quick action and precise coordinates enabled the Valiant to reach the cargo ship in time to rescue its crew of 12. Captain Morrison called her into his office the next morning and said simply, "Good work, Chun. The Navy needs more officers like you." Those words sustained her through the years that followed. Sarah threw herself into her career with single-minded focus. She pursued advanced degrees in international relations and strategic studies, completed specialized training in naval warfare tactics, and sought assignments that would challenge her skills. Each promotion came with increased responsibility and increased scrutiny. As she rose through the ranks, the questions about her qualifications became more sophisticated but no less persistent. Lieutenant Chun became Lieutenant Commander Chun, then Commander Chun. She served tours in the Mediterranean, the Persian Gulf, and the Pacific Fleet. She led training exercises, managed logistics operations, and coordinated joint missions with Allied forces. Her personnel files filled with commendations and recommendations for advancement. Yet with each new position came reminders that her presence was still considered unusual, still required justification. The Iraq War changed everything. Sarah was assigned as operations officer for a carrier strike group deployed to the Persian Gulf. The position required coordinating complex military operations across multiple platforms while maintaining security protocols under constant threat. Sarah's ability to process information quickly and make sound decisions under pressure earned her recognition from commanders throughout the fleet. She managed supply lines that kept 20,000 personnel operational, coordinated airstrikes that protected ground forces, and helped plan humanitarian missions that delivered aid to civilian populations. During one particularly challenging operation, Sarah's quick thinking prevented what could have been a catastrophic friendly fire incident. Intelligence reports indicated enemy positions near a suspected weapons facility, but Sarah noticed inconsistencies in the satellite imagery that suggested civilian presence. She recommended delaying the strike until ground reconnaissance could verify the target. Her caution saved 17 civilians who had been sheltering in the building, including 6 children. The incident earned her the Navy Commendation Medal and recognition from the Joint Chiefs of Staff. The medal ceremony took place at the Pentagon, where Sarah stood alongside 12 other recipients. As cameras flashed and families applauded, Sarah felt the weight of representation on her shoulders. She knew that her achievements would be measured not just against military standards, but against expectations for women in combat leadership roles. Success would open doors for other women. Failure would close them for years. Promotion to captain came with assignment to Naval War College, where Sarah taught strategic planning to rising officers. She enjoyed the intellectual challenge of analyzing historical conflicts and developing new approaches to modern warfare challenges. Her lectures on asymmetric threats and coalition building became popular among students and faculty. Sarah also used her position to mentor young women entering military careers, understanding that her visibility carried responsibility to those who would follow. The mentoring wasn't always easy. Some young officers expected Sarah to shield them from the harsh realities of military culture. Others resented what they perceived as special attention. Sarah learned to balance support with honesty, helping her men develop the resilience necessary for military success, while acknowledging the unique challenges they would face as women in male-dominated environments. Sarah's doctoral dissertation examined the integration of women into combat roles across different military cultures. Her research revealed patterns of resistance and acceptance that correlated with organizational culture rather than individual prejudice. The work earned recognition from defense policy experts and contributed to reforms in military training and evaluation procedures. Sarah realized that her academic work was as important as her operational experience in creating lasting change. The call to return to operational command came when Sarah was offered position as captain of the USS Phoenix, a guided missile cruiser with a crew of 400. The assignment represented a significant milestone. She would be the first Asian American woman to command a major surface combatant. The Phoenix was deploying to the South China Sea, where tensions between various nations created complex political and military challenges requiring diplomatic skill alongside tactical expertise. Command of the Phoenix tested every aspect of Sarah's leadership development. Managing crew dynamics required balancing military discipline with human understanding. Navigating international waters demanded precise knowledge of maritime law and political sensitivity. Coordinating with allied forces required diplomatic skills that went beyond military training. Sarah approached each challenge with the methodical preparation that had characterized her entire career. The deployment lasted 8 months and included port calls in Japan, South Korea, and Australia. Sarah's crew performed exceptionally in joint exercises and humanitarian missions. When a tsunami struck the Philippines, the Phoenix was among the first responders, providing emergency communications and medical support to affected areas. Sarah's leadership during the crisis earned commendations from Philippine government officials and recognition from the international community. Return to port brought promotion to Rear Admiral and assignment to Pentagon staff, where Sarah would oversee logistics planning for Pacific Fleet operations. The position placed her at the center of strategic decision-making processes that would shape American naval policy for the coming decade. Sarah understood that her new role represented not just personal achievement, but historic significance. She was entering the senior ranks where policy was made and priorities were set. The Pentagon assignment introduced Sarah to the complex world of military politics. Decisions involved not just military considerations, but political, economic, and diplomatic factors that required careful balancing. Sarah learned to navigate relationships with civilian officials, congressional staff, and international counterparts while maintaining focus on military effectiveness. She discovered that success at the admiral level required different skills than operational command, demanding political awareness alongside tactical expertise. Sarah's office was located in the D Ring, close to the offices of other senior admirals and the Secretary of the Navy. The proximity to decision-making centers gave her insight into discussions that would determine defense policy for years ahead. Sarah recognized the responsibility that came with access to such information and worked to ensure that operational realities informed strategic planning. The work was intellectually stimulating, but politically challenging. Sarah often found herself advocating for resources and programs that she knew were essential, but faced skepticism from officials who questioned military judgment. She learned to present arguments that addressed political concerns while maintaining operational integrity. The skill proved valuable as she developed relationships with congressional staff who controlled defense appropriations. Sarah's reputation for competence and integrity earned respect from colleagues across service branches and political affiliations. She was frequently asked to brief senior officials on Pacific Fleet capabilities and challenges. Her presentations were known for their clarity and honest assessment of both strengths and weaknesses. Sarah understood that credibility was her most valuable asset and protected it carefully. After 3 years at the Pentagon, Sarah received promotion to Vice Admiral and appointment as Deputy Commander of Pacific Fleet. The position returned her to operational command while maintaining strategic responsibilities. Sarah would oversee day-to-day operations of the largest naval command in the American military while helping to develop long-term strategy for the Pacific region. The promotion ceremony took place at Pearl Harbor, where Sarah's parents and extended family gathered to witness her advancement to the highest ranks of American military leadership. As the 3-star insignia was pinned to her uniform, Sarah thought about the 18-year-old recruit who had left Sacramento with nothing but determination. The journey from enlisted personnel to flag officer had taken 20 years of dedication, sacrifice, and unwavering commitment to excellence. Sarah's new position required managing relationships with allied navies throughout the Pacific region. She traveled frequently to meet with counterparts in Australia, Japan, South Korea, and other nations critical to regional security. These relationships would prove essential as tensions in the South China Sea continued to escalate, and North Korea's nuclear program presented ongoing threats to regional stability. The responsibilities were enormous, but Sarah approached them with confidence built through decades of proven performance. She had earned her position through merit and was prepared to defend both her authority and her decisions. What Sarah didn't anticipate was that her greatest challenge would come not from external threats or operational complexity, but from within her own organization, from people who had never accepted her right to wear the uniform that represented her life's work. Commander Marcus Reed had been waiting for this moment for 3 years. Ever since Admiral Chin's promotion to Pacific Fleet Command had been announced, he had been counting down the days until their paths would cross again. The memory of her rejecting his advances at the Naval War College still burned in his mind like acid, made worse by the fact that she had reported him to the Dean of Students for inappropriate conduct. The investigation that followed had been quietly handled, as such matters often were in military circles. Reed received a letter of reprimand in his personnel file and mandatory training on professional conduct. To outside observers, the punishment might have seemed appropriate for what officials termed a misunderstanding about professional boundaries. But Reed saw it differently. He saw it as his career being damaged by a woman who couldn't take a compliment, who had to turn everything into some kind of political statement about harassment. Reed came from a military family. His father had been a Marine colonel, his grandfather a Navy captain who served in World War II. Growing up, Reed heard stories about military service that painted a picture of brotherhood forged in combat, mutual respect earned through shared danger, and honor that transcended personal differences. The stories never mentioned women, because in the military his father and grandfather knew, women weren't part of the warrior culture that defined service life. When Reed graduated from the Naval Academy, women had been attending for more than 20 years, but their presence still felt like an intrusion to many of the male cadets. Reed learned to mouth the appropriate words about equality and inclusion, but privately he believed that military effectiveness was being compromised by social engineering. He watched female classmates struggle with physical requirements and wondered if standards were being lowered to accommodate them. Reed's early career assignments reinforced his skepticism about women in military roles. He served on ships where female crew members required separate berthing arrangements that reduced operational flexibility. He witnessed what he considered special treatment when female personnel were excused from certain duties for physical limitations or pregnancy. Each instance fed his growing conviction that the military was being weakened by policies designed to achieve political goals rather than military effectiveness. The harassment complaint from Admiral Chun had been the most humiliating experience of Reed's career. During their time at the War College, Reed had approached her after a faculty reception to suggest they continue their discussion about naval strategy over dinner. When she declined, Reed persisted, mentioning that her research on women in combat roles might benefit from the perspective of someone with more operational experience. The conversation escalated when Reed suggested that her academic work was more about advancing feminist ideology than improving military capability. Chin had warned him that his comments were inappropriate and asked him to stop. Reed, emboldened by alcohol and frustrated by her dismissive attitude, had responded by questioning whether her promotion was based on merit or diversity requirements. He suggested that her defensive reaction proved she knew her advancement was unearned. The conversation ended when Chin walked away, but Reed followed her, continuing his commentary until other faculty members intervened. The official investigation found that Reed had violated professional conduct standards through persistent, unwelcome advances and discriminatory comments. The reprimand letter noted that his behavior created a hostile work environment and reflected poor judgment incompatible with leadership responsibilities. Reed was required to complete sensitivity training and warned that future incidents would result in more severe consequences. Reed completed the required training while maintaining his innocence. He claimed his comments had been taken out of context and his behavior mischaracterized by politically motivated investigators. In Reed's version of events, he had merely offered professional criticism that was misconstrued as harassment by someone looking for reasons to claim victimization. The narrative fit Reed's worldview perfectly. He was the real victim of policies that privileged certain groups over qualified individuals like himself. The years following the investigation were difficult for Reed. His personnel file made him less competitive for choice assignments, and colleagues who knew about the incident treated him with careful distance. Reed blamed Chun for the damage to his reputation and career prospects. He began tracking her career with obsessive attention, noting each promotion and assignment while convincing himself that her success was undeserved. When Reed learned that Chun had been promoted to Admiral and assigned to Pacific Fleet Command, his resentment crystallized into something harder and more focused. He began researching her background, looking for evidence that would support his theory about unqualified advancement. Reed found gaps in her combat experience that he believed disqualified her from senior command. He questioned the value of her academic work and suggested that her recognition was based more on symbolic value than military contribution. Reed's current assignment as liaison between Pacific Fleet and Pentagon operations brought him into regular contact with Admiral Chen's office. He used these interactions to gather information about her decision-making and leadership style. Reed convinced himself that he was conducting legitimate oversight of a potentially incompetent commander. In reality, he was feeding a grudge that had grown into an obsession with proving Chen's unfitness for command. The opportunity Reed had been waiting for came during a planning meeting for joint exercises with South Korean forces. Admiral Chun presented a strategy that emphasized diplomatic coordination alongside military preparation. Reed disagreed with the approach, believing it showed weakness that would encourage Chinese aggression in the region. When Chun asked for questions about the proposal, Reed stood and delivered what he considered devastating criticism of her strategic thinking. Reed's comments went beyond professional disagreement. He suggested that Chen's approach reflected a fundamental misunderstanding of military power and international relations. He questioned whether someone with her background could effectively command operations in a region where strength was the only language adversaries understood. Reed implied that diplomatic approaches were ineffective when dealing with authoritarian regimes that respected only force. Admiral Chun responded to Reed's criticism with professional courtesy, acknowledging his concerns while explaining the reasoning behind her strategic approach. She noted that military exercises served multiple purposes, including alliance building and deterrent signaling, requiring coordination between military and diplomatic elements. Chen's response was measured and thorough, demonstrating command of both strategic theory and operational reality. Reed wasn't satisfied with Chen's explanation. He interrupted her response to press his objection, suggesting that her academic background had given her theoretical knowledge without practical understanding. The comment drew uncomfortable silence from other meeting participants, who recognized that Reed was crossing lines of professional conduct. Admiral Chen handled the interruption with calm authority, but Reed interpreted her restraint as weakness. After the meeting, Reed approached several colleagues to continue his criticism of Admiral Chen's strategic approach. He suggested that her promotion reflected political considerations rather than military merit. Reed claimed that operational commanders were being forced to implement policies designed to achieve social goals rather than military objectives. His comments found some receptive ears among officers who shared his skepticism about diversity initiatives. Reed began cultivating relationships with like-minded colleagues who questioned the rapid advancement of women and minorities in senior military positions. The group met informally to discuss what they perceived as declining standards and political interference in military affairs. Reed became a central figure in these discussions, using his knowledge of Admiral Chen's background to support broader arguments about unqualified promotions. The informal network grew to include officers across different services and career fields. Reed maintained contact through encrypted messaging applications that allowed members to share opinions they considered too controversial for official channels. Conversations range from criticism of specific individuals to broader complaints about military culture changing in ways that undermine traditional values. Reed's obsession with Admiral Chun became a focal point for the group's broader concerns. He shared details about her decision-making process and strategic thinking that he gathered through his liaison position. Reed interpreted every policy disagreement as evidence of incompetence and every diplomatic initiative as weakness that would encourage adversary aggression. The group's activities remained below the radar of official attention, but their influence spread through informal networks that existed parallel to official command structures. Reed and his allies used their positions to subtly undermine confidence in leaders they considered unqualified. They questioned decisions, delayed implementation of policies, and created friction that reduced organizational effectiveness. Reed's behavior became increasingly bold as he convinced himself that he was serving a patriotic purpose by exposing incompetent leadership. He began making more direct challenges to Admiral Chen's authority during official meetings. Reed would ask pointed questions designed to highlight what he considered weaknesses in her strategic thinking. He used his technical expertise to challenge aspects of operational plans that fell outside his area of responsibility. Admiral Chen continued to respond to Reed's challenges with professional composure, but colleagues began noticing the pattern of his behavior. Some officers privately expressed concern about Reed's conduct, while others appreciated having someone willing to ask difficult questions about command decisions. The division created an undercurrent of tension that affected working relationships throughout the command structure. Reed interpreted the mixed reactions as validation of his concerns. He believed that other officers shared his doubts about Admiral Chen's qualifications, but lacked the courage to voice them publicly. Reed saw himself as a truth-teller willing to risk personal consequences for the greater good of military effectiveness. The self-image fed his growing confidence in challenging authority he considered illegitimate. The confrontation that would change everything began with a routine briefing about Pacific Fleet readiness levels. Admiral Chen was presenting quarterly assessment data when Reed interrupted with questions about methodology and conclusions. The interruption itself wasn't unprecedented, but Reed's tone carried an edge of disrespect that hadn't been present in previous exchanges. Admiral Chen paused her presentation to address Reed's questions directly. She explained the data collection process and analytical framework that supported her conclusions. Chen's response was thorough and demonstrated mastery of complex technical details that Reed himself didn't fully understand. The comprehensive answer should have satisfied any legitimate professional concern about the briefing content. Instead, Reed escalated his challenge. He suggested that Admiral Chen's assessment was overly optimistic and failed to account for readiness gaps that could compromise operational capability. Reed claimed that political pressure to show positive results was influencing command assessments in ways that created false confidence about fleet capabilities. The accusation crossed a clear line from professional disagreement to personal attack. Reed was essentially claiming that Admiral Chen was either incompetent to assess fleet readiness or dishonest in her reporting to senior leadership. Other meeting participants shifted uncomfortably as they realized they were witnessing something beyond normal command dynamics. Admiral Chen's response was calm but firm. She noted that readiness assessments were based on objective criteria established by Navy standards and verified through independent evaluation processes. Chen explained that her role required honest reporting regardless of political preferences, and she took that responsibility seriously. The response demonstrated both professional knowledge and personal integrity. Reed wasn't finished. As Admiral Chen prepared to continue her briefing, he made a comment that revealed the personal animosity behind his professional criticism. Reed suggested that some officers received advancement beyond their capabilities through policies designed to achieve diversity goals rather than military effectiveness. The comment was clearly directed at Admiral Chen, though Reed was careful not to make the connection explicit. The room fell silent as everyone processed what Reed had just said. His comment wasn't just professional criticism. It was a personal attack based on Admiral Chen's gender and ethnicity disguised as concern about military policy. The disguise was thin enough that everyone present understood the real message Reed was sending. Admiral Chun maintained her composure, but something fundamental had changed. Reed had crossed from disagreement to disrespect, from professional criticism to personal attack. The moment represented a choice point for everyone in the room. They could pretend they hadn't heard what they had just heard, or they could acknowledge that Reed had violated basic standards of military conduct. The meeting ended without resolution. Admiral Chun completed her briefing while Reed sat in sullen silence, convinced that he had made important points about military readiness that were being ignored for political reasons. Other participants filed out quietly, unsure how to process what they had witnessed. The incident would be discussed in hushed conversations throughout the Pentagon for days afterward. Reed left the meeting satisfied that he had finally been direct about concerns that had been bothering him for years. He believed that someone needed to speak truth about the consequences of diversity policies for military effectiveness. Reed convinced himself that his comments served the greater good by highlighting issues that politically correct leadership was afraid to address. What Reed didn't realize was that his behavior had been building toward this moment for months. His pattern of challenges and disrespectful comments had been noticed by multiple colleagues who were documenting incidents for potential future action. Reed had been creating a trail of evidence about his conduct, while believing he was effectively concealing his motivations. The confrontation in the briefing room would prove to be the beginning of Reed's downfall rather than Admiral Chen's. His comment about diversity goals crossed lines that even sympathetic colleagues couldn't ignore. Reed had revealed the personal animosity behind his professional criticism, making it impossible for others to treat his behavior as legitimate disagreement about military policy. The meeting ended 20 minutes later than scheduled, but Admiral Sarah Chun remained in the conference room long after the other participants had filed out. She sat alone at the polished mahogany table, staring at her notes while trying to process what had just happened. In 22 years of military service, she had faced enemy fire, natural disasters, and life-threatening situations that tested her courage and resolve. But nothing had prepared her for the cold hatred she had seen in Commander Reed's eyes. Sarah understood that Reed's comments weren't really about military readiness or strategic policy. They were about her presence in positions that he believed should be occupied by men like him. The realization was exhausting rather than shocking. She had been dealing with variations of Reed's attitude throughout her career. What made this incident different was the public nature of his disrespect and the silence of colleagues who should have intervened. Sarah gathered her materials and walked toward her office, passing through corridors lined with portraits of military leaders from previous generations. The images represented a legacy of service and sacrifice that had inspired her since childhood. Now, they felt like reminders of a tradition that some people believed she had no right to inherit. The weight of representation pressed down on her shoulders like a physical burden. Admiral Chen's office reflected her personality and priorities. Military awards and commendations shared wall space with photographs from humanitarian missions and joint exercises with allied forces. Books on strategic theory sat alongside works on leadership and organizational change. The space represented the breadth of modern military service, combining traditional warrior values with evolving understanding of global security challenges. Sarah's aide, Lieutenant Jennifer Walsh, was waiting with messages and scheduling updates. Walsh had been working with Admiral Chun for 18 months and had developed deep respect for her commander's leadership style and professional integrity. She had also witnessed the subtle and not-so-subtle challenges that Admiral Chun faced from colleagues who questioned her qualifications and authority. Walsh noticed the tension in Admiral Chen's demeanor immediately. "Admiral, is everything all right?" The briefing ran longer than expected. Sarah considered how to respond. She could maintain the facade of professional normalcy and pretend that Reed's behavior was simply robust policy debate. She could minimize the incident to protect herself from appearing weak or overly sensitive. These were the responses that had served her well throughout her career, allowing her to navigate hostile environments while maintaining focus on mission requirements. Instead, Sarah found herself sharing the truth. Commander Reed made some comments that crossed the line from professional disagreement to personal attack. I'm trying to decide how to respond. Walsh's expression hardened. She had heard rumors about Reed's behavior toward female colleagues and had witnessed his disrespectful attitude during previous meetings with Admiral Chin. Admiral, several people have mentioned concerns about Commander Reed's conduct. Maybe it's time to address the pattern officially. The suggestion forced Sarah to confront a decision she had been avoiding. Taking formal action against Reed would require documenting incidents, gathering witness statements, and subjecting herself to investigation processes that could be more damaging to her reputation than his. Military culture still treated harassment complaints with skepticism, particularly when they involved senior officers. Sarah had spent her career proving that she belonged in military leadership by exceeding every standard and ignoring every slight. She had learned to pick battles carefully, focusing on mission accomplishment while avoiding conflicts that could be characterized as personal grievances. The strategy had enabled her remarkable success, but it had also required accepting behavior that would be unthinkable in other professional environments. The phone rang, interrupting Sarah's internal debate. The caller ID showed Admiral James Patterson, her immediate superior and longtime mentor. Patterson had been instrumental in Sarah's career development, providing opportunities and guidance that helped her navigate the complex politics of senior military leadership. His opinion carried enormous weight in Sarah's decision-making process. "Sarah, I heard there was some tension in today's briefing. Want to talk about it?" Sarah appreciated Patterson's direct approach. He had built trust through years of supporting her professional development while being honest about challenges she would face as a woman in military leadership. Patterson understood both the importance of maintaining good order and discipline and the reality of persistent discrimination within military culture. "Commander Reed has been increasingly disrespectful in his interactions with me. Today, he essentially accused me of receiving unearned advancement through diversity programs." It was said in front of 12 other officers, and none of them spoke up. Patterson's silence stretched long enough that Sarah wondered if the connection had been lost. When he finally spoke, his voice carried weight that reflected his 30 years of military experience. "Sarah, you know I have tremendous respect for your capabilities and contributions. You've earned every promotion through merit and dedication. But formal complaints about harassment can become political minefields that damage careers regardless of their validity." The warning was carefully phrased, but Sarah understood its implications. Patterson was advising her to handle Reed's behavior through informal channels rather than official processes that could attract unwanted attention. The advice reflected practical wisdom about military culture, but it also perpetuated systems that allowed discrimination to continue unchallenged. Sarah had reached a decision point that would define the remainder of her career. She could continue the strategy of endurance and excellence that had brought her to senior leadership, accepting Reed's behavior as the price of maintaining her position. Or she could use her authority and influence to challenge systems that enabled discrimination, accepting the risks that came with such confrontation. The choice was interrupted by another phone call, this one from Admiral Michael Torres, commander of Atlantic Fleet Operations. Torres was known for his direct leadership style and intolerance for behavior that undermined unit cohesion. His call suggested that word about the morning's incident was already spreading through military networks. "Sarah, I just got off the phone with someone who was in your briefing today. I want you to know that Commander Reed's behavior was completely inappropriate, and several of us are prepared to support whatever action you decide to take." Torres's statement changed the dynamic significantly. Sarah had assumed she would be fighting alone if she decided to address Reed's conduct formally. Learning that senior colleagues were willing to support her provided both validation and practical assistance that could make the difference between successful action and career damage. "Michael, I appreciate that more than you know. I've been hesitant to make this official because I didn't want to appear unable to handle difficult subordinates. But Reed's behavior today crossed lines that I can't ignore." Torres's response was immediate and emphatic. Sarah, tolerating discrimination isn't strength, it's enablement. Reed has been getting away with this behavior because good people have been making excuses for him. It's time for that to stop. The conversation with Torres provided clarity that Sarah had been lacking. She realized that her previous tolerance of Reed's behavior hadn't protected her career. It had enabled his escalation to more serious misconduct. By avoiding confrontation, she had allowed Reed to believe that his behavior was acceptable, contributing to a hostile environment that affected not just her, but other women throughout the command. Sarah spent the remainder of the afternoon documenting incidents involving Reed's conduct. The pattern was more extensive than she had realized when viewed as a comprehensive record. Reed had been pushing boundaries for months through comments, questions, and behaviors that individually might seem minor, but collectively created a hostile work environment. Lieutenant Walsh helped compile witness information and supporting documentation. Several colleagues provided written statements about Reed's behavior, including incidents that Sarah hadn't been aware of involving other female personnel. The evidence revealed that Reed's conduct was part of a broader pattern of discrimination rather than isolated incidents targeting only Admiral Chun. The decision to proceed with formal action became easier as the scope of Reed's misconduct became clear. Sarah realized that her responsibility as a senior leader extended beyond protecting her own career to ensuring that military standards were maintained throughout her command. Allowing Reed's behavior to continue would send a message that discrimination was tolerable as long as it remained subtle enough to maintain plausible deniability. Sarah scheduled a meeting with the Inspector General's office for the following morning. The IG investigation would be thorough and potentially career-ending for Reed if the evidence supported charges of discrimination and conduct unbecoming an officer. Sarah understood that initiating the investigation would subject her own career to scrutiny, but she had confidence in her record and the quality of evidence against Reed. The evening brought phone calls from colleagues throughout the military hierarchy. Some expressed support for Sarah's decision to address Reed's conduct formally. Others warned about potential backlash from officers who might view harassment complaints as weapons used to advance political agendas. The mixed reactions reflected broader tensions within military culture about changing standards for acceptable behavior. Sarah's conversation with her husband, Dr. David Chun, provided perspective that helped her maintain focus on fundamental principles. David was a civilian physician who understood military culture through his wife's career, but wasn't constrained by its political considerations. His advice was simple. You've spent 22 years proving you belong in military leadership. Now use that leadership to protect people who don't have your rank and influence. The truth of David's observation crystallized Sarah's thinking. She had achieved senior leadership not just for personal accomplishment, but to influence military culture in ways that created opportunities for others. Tolerating Reed's discrimination violated the responsibility that came with her authority and undermined the progress that her career was supposed to represent. Sarah also considered the broader implications of her decision for women throughout the military. Her response to Reed's behavior would be watched and analyzed by countless personnel who faced similar challenges in their own careers. Failure to act would signal that even senior leaders were powerless against discrimination, while successful action could encourage others to report misconduct rather than endure it silently. The night before her meeting with the Inspector General, Sarah received an unexpected phone call from Reed himself. His tone was conciliatory as he suggested that their professional disagreements might have been misinterpreted as personal conflict. Reed offered to clear the air through informal discussion that could resolve any misunderstandings before they became official matters. Reed's overture revealed that he understood the seriousness of his situation. Word about Sarah's investigation had reached him through military networks, and he was attempting damage control that might limit consequences for his misconduct. The call confirmed Sarah's assessment that Reed's behavior was calculated rather than inadvertent, making formal action more appropriate than informal resolution. Sarah declined Reed's offer for informal discussion. She explained that his behavior had created a hostile work environment that required official investigation rather than personal negotiation. Reed's response revealed his true character as his conciliatory tone disappeared, replaced by anger at her refusal to handle the matter quietly. The conversation ended with Reed making veiled threats about the consequences of proceeding with formal complaints. Reed's threats strengthened Sarah's resolve to proceed with the investigation. His behavior during the phone call demonstrated that he viewed discrimination as acceptable and harassment complaints as illegitimate attacks on his authority. Reed clearly believed that his rank and gender should protect him from consequences for behavior that would be unacceptable in any professional environment. The morning of her meeting with the Inspector General, Sarah received a text message from Lieutenant Walsh with an urgent request to meet before the scheduled appointment. Walsh's information changed everything Sarah thought she knew about Reed's misconduct and the scope of discrimination within her command structure. Walsh revealed that Reed had been coordinating with a network of male officers who shared his views about women in military leadership. The group had been using encrypted communication to share derogatory comments about female personnel and coordinate efforts to undermine their authority. Walsh had learned about the network from female colleagues who had overheard conversations and documented suspicious behavior patterns. The revelation transformed Sarah's understanding of the situation from individual misconduct to organized discrimination. Reed wasn't acting alone. He was part of a systematic effort to resist integration of women into senior military positions. The network's activities explained patterns of resistance and hostility that Sarah had attributed to isolated incidents rather than coordinated campaign. Armed with information about the broader conspiracy, Sarah entered her meeting with the Inspector General with evidence of misconduct that extended far beyond Reed's personal behavior. The investigation would need to examine not just individual actions, but organizational culture that enabled discriminatory networks to operate within official command structures. The IG officer, Colonel Maria Santos, listened carefully as Sarah presented her evidence and described the pattern of discrimination she had experienced. Santos had handled numerous harassment cases throughout her career and understood both the importance of thorough investigation and the political sensitivities involved when senior officers were accused of misconduct. Colonel Santos explained the investigation process and timeline, warning Sarah that the inquiry would attract significant attention throughout the military hierarchy. The case involved senior officers and raised questions about military culture that would resonate far beyond the immediate participants. Santos emphasized the importance of maintaining confidentiality while ensuring that all relevant evidence was properly documented. Sarah left the meeting confident that the investigation would be conducted thoroughly and professionally. She understood that the process would be difficult and potentially damaging to her career regardless of the outcome. But she also knew that failure to act would perpetuate systems of discrimination that violated military values and undermined operational effectiveness. The decision to proceed with formal action represented a turning point not just in Sarah's career, but in her understanding of leadership responsibility. She had spent years proving her individual worth while hoping that excellence would eventually overcome prejudice. Now she realized that systemic change required direct confrontation with discrimination rather than patient endurance of it. As Sarah returned to her office, she felt the weight of decisions that would affect not just her career, but the careers of countless women throughout the military. The investigation would test military justice systems and reveal whether official commitments to equality were supported by substantive action against discrimination. Sarah had initiated a process that could transform military culture, but only if she had the courage to see it through to completion. The Pentagon corridor was busier than usual for a Thursday morning, with staff officers moving between meetings and briefings that kept the massive building functioning around the clock. Admiral Sarah Chun walked with purpose toward the conference room, where she would deliver her monthly readiness report to the Joint Chiefs of Staff. The meeting represented routine business that she had conducted dozens of times, but today felt different because of the investigation that had been quietly proceeding for 2 weeks. Colonel Santos had briefed Sarah the previous evening about preliminary findings from the Inspector General's inquiry. The investigation had uncovered evidence supporting all of Sarah's allegations against Commander Reed, plus additional misconduct involving other female personnel that hadn't been previously reported. More significantly, investigators had confirmed the existence of the discriminatory network that Lieutenant Walsh had exposed, revealing organized efforts to undermine women in leadership positions throughout the Pacific Fleet. Sarah carried herself with the confident bearing that had characterized her entire military career, but internally, she was processing the emotional toll of the investigation process. Formal procedures required her to maintain professional distance, while investigators interviewed colleagues, analyzed communication records, and documented patterns of discrimination that she had endured for months. The process forced her to relive incidents that she had tried to forget while remaining focused on her operational responsibilities. The readiness briefing was scheduled for 1000 hours in the secure conference room adjacent to the Joint Chiefs' offices. Sarah had prepared extensively, knowing that her performance would be scrutinized more carefully than usual because of rumors circulating about the ongoing investigation. Military culture demanded that personal controversies never interfere with professional duties, requiring Sarah to demonstrate competence while managing the stress of potentially career-ending legal proceedings. As Sarah approached the conference room, she noticed Commander Reed standing near the entrance, apparently waiting for someone. His presence surprised her because he wasn't scheduled to participate in the briefing and had no official reason to be in that area of the Pentagon. Reed's positioning suggested deliberate intent to intercept Sarah before the meeting, raising concerns about his motivations and state of mind. Reed had been increasingly isolated within the command structure as word about the investigation spread through informal networks. Colleagues who had previously socialized with him were maintaining careful distance to avoid association with someone under official scrutiny. The isolation had apparently affected Reed's judgment, leading to increasingly erratic behavior that colleagues found concerning. Sarah decided to acknowledge Reed professionally while avoiding extended interaction that might escalate tensions. She nodded briefly as she approached the conference room, but Reed stepped forward to block her path. His positioning forced Sarah to stop, creating a confrontational dynamic that immediately attracted attention from other personnel in the corridor. Admiral Chun, I think we need to discuss this investigation before it goes any further. You're making a mistake that will damage both our careers. Reed's tone carried an edge of desperation beneath his attempt at authoritative command. Sarah recognized that he was trying to pressure her into withdrawing the complaint through a combination of veiled threats and appeals to shared professional interests. The approach revealed both his desperation and his fundamental misunderstanding of Sarah's motivations for pursuing formal action. Commander Reed, I have a briefing to attend, and you're not scheduled to participate. This conversation is inappropriate given the ongoing investigation. Sarah's response was professionally correct, but Reed wasn't prepared to accept dismissal. He moved closer, reducing the physical distance between them in a way that felt threatening despite being technically within bounds of acceptable professional interaction. The aggressive positioning was calculated to intimidate while maintaining plausible deniability about threatening behavior. Sarah, you know this whole thing is political theater designed to advance your career at my expense. The investigation will reveal that you're using harassment allegations to eliminate legitimate criticism of your leadership decisions. Reed's use of her first name was deliberately disrespectful, intended to reduce her authority while establishing his dominance in the interaction. The informal address also suggested familiarity that didn't exist, creating false impression of personal relationship that might justify his behavior. Sarah recognized the manipulation and responded with increased formality that restored appropriate professional distance. Commander Reed, you will address me by rank and title. Your characterization of the investigation is incorrect and inappropriate. Step aside so I can attend my scheduled briefing. Sarah's command voice carried the authority of 22 years of military leadership, but Reed was beyond rational response to normal military discipline. His career was in jeopardy, his reputation was destroyed, and his worldview was under assault by events he couldn't control. The combination created a psychological state where normal restraints on behavior no longer applied. You think your rank makes you untouchable, but everyone knows you're just a diversity hire who got promoted beyond her capabilities. The investigation will backfire when people realize you're using political correctness to cover up your own incompetence. Reed's accusation contained all the themes that had motivated his harassment for months, but now they were delivered with public clarity that removed any pretense about his motivations. The words hung in the corridor like toxic smoke, heard by multiple personnel who stopped their conversations to witness the confrontation between senior officers. Sarah felt the familiar surge of anger that Reed's accusations always triggered, but her response was controlled by years of experience managing hostile encounters. She recognized that Reed was attempting to provoke an emotional reaction that would support his narrative about her unfitness for command. Sarah refused to provide him with the satisfaction of seeing her lose composure. "Commander Reed, your comments are inappropriate and insubordinate. Report to your immediate supervisor for counseling on professional conduct standards." Sarah's order was clear and appropriate, but Reed had passed the point where military discipline could control his behavior. He had convinced himself that the investigation represented an existential threat that justified extraordinary measures to protect his career. Reed believed that public confrontation might expose what he saw as the political nature of harassment allegations. "I'm not taking orders from someone who got her rank through affirmative action instead of merit. You don't belong in uniform, and everyone knows it." Reed's declaration crossed every line of military conduct and professional behavior. The words constituted open insubordination combined with discrimination based on gender and ethnicity. Multiple witnesses heard the statement clearly, creating irrefutable evidence of misconduct that would support serious disciplinary action. Sarah realized that Reed had effectively destroyed his own career through public behavior that no military justice system could ignore. His accusations revealed the depth of hatred that had motivated his months of harassment while providing evidence that would strengthen the ongoing investigation. Reed had chosen self-destruction over accepting responsibility for his misconduct. "Commander Reed, you are relieved of duty pending investigation of your conduct. Report to base security immediately." Sarah's relief order was appropriate and necessary given Reed's clear violation of military discipline, but Reed wasn't prepared to accept consequences for his behavior. He had convinced himself that Sarah's authority was illegitimate, making her orders invalid regardless of military law and regulations. Reed's response revealed complete breakdown of military discipline and respect for chain of command. "You can't relieve me. You don't have the authority because your rank is political theater, not military leadership." Reed's refusal to accept relief from duty constituted additional insubordination that would support court-martial proceedings. His denial of Sarah's authority revealed the depth of his discriminatory beliefs and complete rejection of military order. Reed had essentially declared himself outside military discipline through refusal to recognize legitimate authority. The confrontation was attracting significant attention as personnel throughout the corridor stopped their activities to witness the extraordinary breakdown of military protocol. Senior officers rarely engaged in public disputes, making Reed's behavior unprecedented in most observers' experience. The audience created additional pressure for both participants while providing witnesses to document exactly what occurred. Sarah recognized that Reed was beyond rational persuasion and that continued engagement would only escalate the situation further. Her priority was maintaining her own professional composure while ensuring that Reed's behavior was properly documented for disciplinary action. Sarah prepared to end the confrontation by walking around Reed toward the conference room entrance. Reed interpreted Sarah's movement as retreat that validated his challenge to her authority. His sense of victory, combined with accumulated resentment, to produce the decision that would complete his career destruction. As Sarah passed him, Reed reached out and pushed her shoulder, causing her to stumble sideways into the corridor wall. The physical contact represented assault on a senior officer, crossing from verbal insubordination to violent misconduct that would result in criminal charges rather than administrative discipline. Reed had committed an act that no military justice system could treat as acceptable regardless of any mitigating circumstances or political considerations. Sarah regained her balance immediately, but the damage was complete. Reed had assaulted a superior officer in front of multiple witnesses, creating evidence that would support court-martial and dismissal from military service. The physical attack also revealed the violent potential that had been underlying Reed's harassment throughout the investigation period. Security to Corridor 7 Alpha immediately. Officer assault in progress. Lieutenant Walsh's voice carried clearly through the corridor as she summoned security personnel to respond to Reed's attack. Her quick thinking ensured rapid response while creating official documentation of the incident through security channels. Walsh had positioned herself near the conference room entrance and witnessed the entire confrontation from beginning to end. Reed seemed stunned by his own behavior, as if the physical attack had been involuntary rather than deliberate decision. He stared at Sarah with mixture of hatred and confusion, while other personnel maintained careful distance from someone who had demonstrated willingness to use violence against superior officers. Reed had become a threat that required immediate containment rather than military colleague, deserving professional courtesy. Sarah maintained her composure despite the shock of being physically assaulted by a subordinate officer. Her priority was ensuring that proper procedures were followed to document Reed's misconduct while preventing further escalation that might endanger other personnel. Sarah's leadership during the crisis demonstrated the competence and judgment that Reed had questioned throughout his campaign of harassment. Security personnel arrived within minutes and took Reed into custody without resistance. His compliance with security procedures was automatic, reflecting years of military conditioning that overcame his temporary loss of control. Reed would be processed through military police channels while investigators documented the assault and prepared charges for court-martial proceedings. The corridor gradually returned to normal activity as personnel resumed their duties, but conversations throughout the Pentagon would focus on the morning's incident for weeks afterward. Reed's behavior provided stark illustration of discriminatory attitudes that persisted within military culture despite official policies promoting equality and inclusion. Sarah proceeded to her scheduled briefing with the Joint Chiefs, where she delivered her readiness report with professional competence that impressed colleagues who knew about the morning's incident. Her ability to maintain focus on mission requirements despite personal attack demonstrated leadership qualities that validated her advancement to senior command positions. The briefing concluded with expressions of support from Joint Chiefs members who condemned Reed's behavior while praising Sarah's handling of the crisis. Their public statements would send clear messages throughout the military hierarchy about acceptable conduct standards and consequences for discrimination and harassment. Reed's assault marked the end of his military career and the beginning of serious legal consequences that would affect his civilian employment prospects for years afterward. The investigation would reveal the full scope of his misconduct while documenting the discriminatory network that had enabled his harassment campaign. Sarah's decision to pursue formal action against Reed's discrimination had been vindicated through events that demonstrated the seriousness of his misconduct and the importance of addressing harassment through official channels. The morning's confrontation provided dramatic conclusion to months of careful investigation and legal proceedings. The incident also marked a turning point for military culture and attitudes toward discrimination and harassment. Reed's behavior had been so extreme and public that it forced acknowledgement of problems that many preferred to ignore or minimize. Change would be difficult and slow, but Sarah's courage in confronting discrimination had initiated processes that would benefit future generations of military personnel. As Sarah returned to her office, she reflected on the morning's events and their implications for her career and military service generally. Reed's attack had been traumatic, but it had also provided unmistakable evidence of the hatred that motivated discrimination throughout military culture. The truth could no longer be denied or minimized by people who preferred comfortable illusions about equality and progress. The real work was just beginning. Sarah would need to help implement changes that addressed not just individual misconduct, but systemic problems that enabled discrimination to flourish within military organizations. The task would require sustained effort over many years, but Sarah was prepared for the challenge because she understood that leadership meant accepting responsibility for difficult change rather than managing comfortable status quo. The news spread through military networks faster than any official communication could travel. Within hours of Commander Reed's assault on Admiral Chun, encrypted messages were flying between military bases around the world as personnel shared details about the unprecedented breakdown of military discipline in the Pentagon corridor. The incident had shattered assumptions about acceptable behavior while forcing confrontation with discrimination that many preferred to ignore. Admiral Michael Torres was in his Atlantic Fleet headquarters when his chief of staff burst into his office with initial reports about the morning's events. Torres had been expecting some kind of resolution to the investigation involving Reed and Admiral Chun, but physical assault was beyond anything he had anticipated. The escalation revealed how dangerous Reed had become while demonstrating the courage required for Admiral Chun to maintain her pursuit of formal justice. Torres immediately contacted his counterparts throughout the military hierarchy to coordinate response to the crisis. The assault represented not just criminal misconduct, but symbolic challenge to military values and leadership principles. How the institution responded would send clear messages about whether official commitments to equality were supported by substantive action against discrimination. Admiral Patricia Williams, Chief of Naval Personnel, was already fielding phone calls from reporters seeking comment about the Pentagon incident when Torres reached her. News of the assault was leaking through unofficial channels despite attempts to maintain security around ongoing legal proceedings. Williams understood that media attention would intensify pressure for swift action while creating opportunities to demonstrate institutional commitment to addressing harassment. Williams had been tracking the investigation into Reed's conduct since its inception, recognizing its potential significance for military culture and personnel policies. The case represented a test of whether military justice systems could handle discrimination cases effectively, or whether political considerations would compromise efforts to hold perpetrators accountable for misconduct. The assault changed everything by providing undeniable evidence of Reed's dangerous character and complete breakdown of military discipline. Williams realized that the incident created opportunity to demonstrate institutional intolerance for discrimination while sending clear messages about consequences for harassment and assault. Within 6 hours of the incident, Reed was formally charged with assault on a superior officer, insubordination, conduct unbecoming an officer, and violation of military equal opportunity policies. The charges carried potential penalties, including dismissal from service, reduction in rank, forfeiture of pay, and civilian criminal prosecution. Reed's military career was effectively over, but the broader implications were just beginning to unfold. Admiral Chun spent the afternoon being interviewed by investigators, medical personnel, and legal advisors who documented every aspect of the assault and its aftermath. The process was exhausting, but necessary to ensure that proper evidence was collected for both military and civilian legal proceedings. Sarah's cooperation with investigators demonstrated her commitment to accountability while providing foundation for systemic changes. The investigation into Reed's discriminatory network was accelerating as investigators used his communication records and electronic devices to identify other participants in the conspiracy against women in military leadership. The digital evidence revealed extensive coordination between multiple officers who had been working to undermine female colleagues through harassment, professional sabotage, and discriminatory practices. Lieutenant Commander James Patterson, Admiral Torres's aide, found himself under investigation when investigators discovered his participation in the discriminatory network's encrypted communications. Patterson had shared derogatory comments about female personnel while coordinating with Reed to obstruct Admiral Chen's initiatives. His involvement demonstrated how discrimination had penetrated multiple levels of military hierarchy. Patterson's case illustrated the challenge facing military leadership as they attempted to address systemic discrimination. Unlike Reed's obvious misconduct, Patterson's behavior was subtle enough to maintain plausible deniability while contributing to hostile environment that affected multiple female personnel. Investigators would need to determine whether Patterson's conduct warranted formal discipline or could be addressed through training and counseling. The discriminatory network had included officers from different services and geographic locations, revealing coordination that crossed traditional military boundaries. Investigators found evidence of planned efforts to discredit female leaders, obstruct their career advancement, and create hostile environments that would encourage their resignation from military service. Admiral Chen's decision to pursue formal action against Reed had exposed a conspiracy that extended far beyond individual harassment to organized resistance against military integration policies. The discovery validated her assessment that Reed's behavior represented systemic problems rather than isolated incidents of personal misconduct. The Pentagon's response to the crisis reflected both institutional commitment to addressing discrimination and political awareness of media scrutiny surrounding the incident. Secretary of Defense Margaret Collins issued a statement condemning Reed's assault while reaffirming military commitment to equality and inclusion. The statement emphasized that discrimination and harassment violated military values and would face serious consequences. Collins also announced the formation of a special review panel to examine military culture and procedures for addressing discrimination and harassment. The panel would be led by retired Admiral Susan Martinez, the Navy's first female four-star admiral, and would include representatives from all service branches plus civilian experts in organizational psychology and civil rights law. The announcement of the review panel reflected recognition that Reed's assault was symptomatic of broader problems requiring comprehensive solutions. Military leadership understood that symbolic responses would be insufficient to address discrimination that had been documented throughout multiple organizations and career fields. Media coverage of the incident focused initially on the dramatic nature of Reed's assault, but quickly expanded to examine broader questions about military culture and treatment of women in leadership positions. Admiral Chen found herself reluctantly thrust into spotlight as reporters sought interviews about her experience and perspectives on military discrimination. Sarah chose to provide limited media interviews that focused on systemic issues rather than personal experiences. She understood that excessive media attention could undermine her effectiveness as a military leader while potentially compromising ongoing legal proceedings. Sarah's measured response demonstrated political sophistication that enhanced her credibility with both military and civilian audiences. The media coverage included profiles of Admiral Chen's distinguished career and accomplishments that contrasted sharply with Reed's discriminatory characterizations. Reporters documented her combat service, humanitarian missions, and strategic contributions that had earned recognition from allies and adversaries alike. The factual record demolished Reed's claims about unqualified advancement while highlighting the excellence required for Admiral Chen to overcome discriminatory barriers. Reed's court-martial proceedings began within 30 days of his assault on Admiral Chen, reflecting military justice system's capacity for swift action when evidence was clear and misconduct was undeniable. The prosecution presented overwhelming evidence of Reed's criminal behavior while documenting the harassment campaign that had preceded his violent breakdown. Reed's defense attorneys attempted to portray their client as someone who had suffered mental breakdown under pressure rather than calculating discriminator who had planned harassment campaign. The strategy required acknowledging Reed's misconduct while seeking reduced penalties through claims of diminished capacity and psychological stress. The defense strategy failed because digital evidence revealed extensive planning and coordination that contradicted claims about spontaneous breakdown. Reed's communications with other conspirators demonstrated calculated effort to undermine Admiral Chun while evading detection through careful operational security. The evidence showed premeditation that precluded successful insanity or diminished capacity defenses. Admiral Chun testified during Reed's court-martial with dignity and precision that impressed observers from across the military hierarchy. Her testimony documented months of harassment while demonstrating the professionalism and competence that had characterized her response to discrimination. Sarah's performance during cross-examination revealed why she had been successful in challenging assignments throughout her career. The court-martial panel deliberated for less than 2 hours before finding Reed guilty on all charges. The sentence included dismissal from military service, reduction to enlisted rank, forfeiture of all pay and allowances, and recommendation for civilian criminal prosecution. The punishment represented complete destruction of Reed's military career while sending clear messages about consequences for discrimination and assault. Reed's dismissal was accompanied by similar actions against other participants in the discriminatory network as investigators completed their inquiry into organized harassment activities. 7 officers faced court-martial or administrative separation, while 12 others received letters of reprimand and mandatory training on professional conduct standards. The systematic response to discrimination conspiracy demonstrated military commitment to addressing organizational problems rather than simply punishing individual misconduct. The breadth of disciplinary action sent clear messages throughout the military hierarchy about institutional intolerance for harassment and discrimination. Admiral Chen's role in exposing the discriminatory network earned recognition from military and civilian leaders who understood the courage required to challenge systemic problems. Her willingness to pursue formal action despite personal and professional risks had protected other female personnel while advancing military progress toward genuine equality and inclusion. The Special Review Panel led by Admiral Martinez produced comprehensive recommendations for improving military culture and procedures for addressing discrimination. The report called for enhanced training, improved reporting mechanisms, stronger accountability measures, and cultural changes that would make harassment socially unacceptable throughout military organizations. Implementation of the panel's recommendations required sustained effort over several years, but the foundation had been established through Admiral Chen's courage and the institutional response to Reed's assault. Military leadership demonstrated commitment to change that went beyond symbolic gestures to substantive reforms in policies and practices. Admiral Chun received promotion to full admiral and assignment as Vice Chief of Naval Operations, making her the highest-ranking Asian American woman in military history. The promotion reflected recognition of her distinguished service while acknowledging the leadership she had demonstrated during the discrimination crisis. Sarah's new position provided platform for implementing changes that would benefit future generations of military personnel. She used her influence to mentor young women entering military careers while advocating for policies that would prevent harassment and discrimination. Sarah understood that her success created obligations to those who would follow her path. The changes initiated by Admiral Chen's courage extended beyond individual careers to fundamental transformation of military culture. Training programs incorporated lessons learned from the discrimination investigation, while leadership development emphasized ethical behavior and inclusive practices that reflected military values. Reed's assault had been intended to silence Admiral Chun and validate discriminatory attitudes that question women's fitness for military leadership. Instead, his behavior exposed the hatred underlying discrimination while demonstrating the strength and professionalism of the leader he had tried to destroy. The incident became a turning point in military history, marking the moment when institutional commitment to equality moved from aspiration to enforceable standard. Admiral Chen's leadership during the crisis provided model for addressing discrimination that would influence military culture for generations. Years later, Admiral Chen would reflect on the morning when Reed's push changed everything. The physical assault had been traumatic, but it had also created opportunity for transformative change that protected countless military personnel from harassment and discrimination. Sarah's decision to pursue formal action had required enormous courage, but it had fulfilled the leadership responsibility that came with her rank and position. The corridor where Reed assaulted Admiral Chen was later renamed in honor of military personnel who had demonstrated moral courage in challenging discrimination and harassment. A small plaque commemorated those who had stood up for military values when others remained silent, serving as a reminder that leadership required action rather than just position. Admiral Chen's legacy extended far beyond her personal achievements to include the cultural transformation that her courage had initiated. The military had become a more just and inclusive institution because one leader had refused to accept discrimination as the price of service. Sarah's example inspired others to speak up against harassment, while demonstrating that institutional change was possible when leaders were willing to take personal risks for principled action. The story of Admiral Chen and Commander Reed became required study in military leadership courses, teaching future officers about the importance of moral courage and the consequences of discrimination. Students learned that military excellence required not just technical competence, but ethical behavior that reflected the values their uniforms represented. Sarah Chen had entered military service as an 18-year-old recruit seeking to serve something larger than herself. She had achieved that goal by transforming an institution that had initially questioned her right to serve. The journey from enlisted personnel to four-star admiral had required extraordinary dedication and sacrifice, but it had created opportunities for others while advancing military effectiveness through genuine equality and inclusion.